Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. It's been great getting to know Sarah and Emily, and we'll be meeting the others on Tuesday as we all practice our beauty pageant smiles while they announce the winner. This is a real thrill for me because I really have no business being on this shortlist. It's the only novel on the list, and writing a novel is kind of exactly the opposite of the scientific method. So I'm very honored that the female scientist who I invented in this novel is given the props of being on this list with actual scientists. It's really wonderful. So to begin, I need to tell you a bit about this book, and in doing that, I have to tell you about my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather was, I am very sorry to report, a horrible man. He was horrible in so many ways. He was a shady Philadelphia lawyer. He was incredibly brilliant. He passed the bar at the age of 19, and despite that talent and promise, never really worked in any sort of earnest or sincere way as a lawyer for most of his life, although he did use his incredible gifts at finding contractual loopholes in wills to try to cheat inheritances out of his rival family members. So he did put his law degree to use in some ways. He drank a lot too much. He could be savagely, verbally abusive to his wife and children, friends and neighbors, although he called that abuse by a different name, wit. He was the bad combination of lazy and entitled. He was the kind of person who believes that he ought to be able to have a sailboat even as his children are being pulled out of school mid-semester because the tuition has not been paid. He's selfish. He was domineering. He wanted all the world's attention. He was a narcissist. And when he didn't get his way, he was capable of exploding into unbelievable purple-faced temper tantrums. In Alcoholics Anonymous, they have a name for exactly the kind of character that my great-grandfather was. They call him the King Baby. But I loved him. And I can say that with considerable authority because I knew him. I knew him really well. I knew him a lot better than most people my age can claim to know anyone who was born in 1889. My great-grandfather, like many narcissists, refused to die. He could not imagine a world without him in it, and so he clung to life until just like days short of his 100th birthday. So he was a presence in my life, my entire childhood and my adolescence. He was vivid and sharp right up until the end, and I adored him mostly because he had, in addition to a sort of larger-than-life spectacular character, he had one supremely redeeming quality. My great-grandfather loved books. He was the first bibliophile who I ever met, and before I even knew what that word meant, I knew that he was one. And I suspected that I was one, and I knew that we were kin at that level. When I was a child, I actually believed for a while, quite literally, that my great-grandfather's house was made out of books. Because when you were inside of it, that's what it appeared like. You know, it was just shelves of books in every direction. And he tended to them lovingly, much more lovingly than he tended to his own family. He actually disowned a sister-in-law of his once for having the audacity during a home renovation project to write him a letter requesting that he please send her 6 linear feet of attractive books for a shelf. He found that so disgraceful that he didn't talk to her for years. And he knew their contents really well, and he cared about them enormously, and he cared about what we thought about them. And he sort of took literary stewardship over his descendants and over me. Oliver Wendell Holmes said that all men are afraid of books who have not handled them since infancy. And I never had to have that fear in my life because he put those books into my hands from a very early age. The first book that my great-grandfather gave to me was delivered into the house shortly after I was delivered into the house. It was this splendidly illustrated volume that was called The Great Swedish Fairy Tales. And he had inscribed it to me, thus ensuring that I would be raised with trolls and goblins and runaway boys named Olaf. And as I got older, he introduced me to Ogden Nash, to Kipling, to Dickens, to Trollope, but also to really weird and obscure things from his generation. So I'm probably the only person my age walking around who has these grisly 19th century children's poems in my mind that he put there because he made me memorize them. Poems like Little Willie Obergusum clutched a kitten to his bosom, squeezed so hard the kitten busted, and with gore, Willie's buttons rusted. Really appropriate things for a 6-year-old child to be taught by her great-grandfather. So he shunted and funneled books and stories to me for as long as he lived. But the book that would end up having the biggest influence on my life that came down through him, I don't think he ever intended to land in my hands, and yet it did. And I'll tell you the story of that. The book in question was a magnificent sumptuous volume called Captain Cook's Voyages that was originally published here in London in 1784. My great-grandfather had found it at an antiquarian bookstore in Philadelphia, probably around World War I. And he'd given it to my parents as a wedding gift before I was born. This thing was just a monumental object. It's about this big, very thick. It was published at the time that many of the people who had been on Cook's voyages were still very much alive. It was not a third-person account of Captain Cook's voyages. It was actually the unedited ship's logs of every single day of those 3 circumnavigations. And it wasn't only that. When you opened it up, there were fold-outs. There would be title charts and maps that would fold out from it at various places. It was also filled with botanical illustrations, with amazing etchings of ethnographic studies. It was a treasure. It was something that really would have been at home in a king's library. But it ended up in our house. And I grew up on a small New England farm. We didn't have fancy things, largely due to my great-grandfather's profligacy. And that was really the nicest, maybe the only really nice thing that we had in our house. And my mother, knowing its value, put it on the very top shelf in the living room, and it was forbidden to us. My sister and I were absolutely forbidden to touch it. And so, of course, we touched it constantly and endlessly because we weren't dummies. We knew that it must have talismanic magical power, or else it wouldn't be so gorgeous and it wouldn't be so forbidden. And so I clearly remember getting kitchen chairs and pulling them into the living room and sort of scampering up the shelf to get it from behind my mother's back. And we had a kind of weird childhood for somebody of my generation. I didn't grow up with TV. We didn't have neighbors our age. So my sister and I had to invent our own worlds, and we were constantly creating plays and performing them. And we used Captain Cook's Voyages as a prop all the time in these plays. So if we had a king who had to hand down a sentence of execution, out would come the 1784 Captain Cook's Voyages, and we'd plop it open, and the king would find the law. Or if there was a sorcerer looking for a magic spell, like down would come the volume. I'm sorry to say that we used it not only in the house, but in the barn, in the woods. I used it as a step stool. I used it as a chair. I used it as a lunch table. I used it quite roughly and all the time until we grew out of those imaginative years and we finally left it unmolested on the top shelf of the living room again. And I went on to my life and did not think about Captain Cook or that book for almost 30 years. And then it came to be 2010, and I went home to Connecticut, to the farm where I was raised, to help my mother, who was sort of downsizing and getting things organized and getting rid of a lot of stuff in the house that she had lived in since the early 70s. And we were doing that thing that you do when you've got boxes going to charity and boxes going to this family member and boxes going to the new house. And we were in the living room chatting and packing up books. And all of a sudden I heard my mother gasp in horror. I had my back to her. I just heard this shocked noise come from her. And she said, "My God, Liz, look what you did." And I turned around and saw that she was holding something that was immediately very familiar to me. I also had that guilty moment of, what did I do? And she was holding this giant, magnificent volume of Captain Cook's Voyages. She had opened it just to sort of shake it out and make sure there were no loose pieces of paper or important objects in there. And she had discovered that probably around the age of 4 or 5, based on the handwriting, I had gotten hold of a pen and I had scrawled my name across the frontispiece of this book. Therefore, in one moment, both destroying it and laying claim to it. And she sort of went ashen because she had felt it was her responsibility to safeguard this thing. And then I guess she sort of surrendered to the inevitability of it, and she walked across the room and she handed it to me and she said, "Well, you ruined it. I guess it's yours." And she put it in my hands. And in that moment of transfer, when she set that book back into my hands, I felt this electrical current run up my arms and the hair stood up on the back of my neck. And I could tell immediately that all of the magic and sorcery that my sister and I had imbued this book with when we were children was still vibrantly within it. And when you are a writer and a creative person, I think it's your obligation to follow up on a sensation like that, because a sensation like that does not happen every day. And it started to occur to me that maybe my scrawling of my name across that book in childhood was not necessarily an act of desecration, although it was, but it was also maybe a message from my younger self to my future self saying, this is ours, right? Claim this. There's something in here for you. And around that time, I had been looking for a subject for a novel, and I knew that I wanted to write the kind of great big 19th century novels that my great-grandfather had introduced me to and that I'd always loved. I just didn't have an idea for one. And so I took Captain Cook's Voyages home with me, and I did the only thing that I had not done to it when I was a child. I read it. And it was not an easy read. It's tiny 18th century print, and all the S's are F's, and a lot of it is nautical, a lot of it is political. But I paged through this, and I was determined to find in there the seed for the book that I was imagining that I wanted to write next. And initially, of course, it made sense. My first thought was that I was probably going to be writing a novel about Captain Cook because he was the star of this whole story. But I soon discovered as I was reading it that he's actually not that interesting a guy. It's and it's not to take away his achievements because he was an important person, but he sort of reminded me of our George Washington, which is to say so upright and unimpeachable that he's incredibly boring. But I found that in like great novels, you often find that the secondary characters are more interesting than the primary characters, and that was the case here, that there's really captivating secondary character who kept showing up on the pages, who caught my eye and kept my eye. And that was, of course, Sir Joseph Banks. Sir Joseph Banks, who in the early 1770s was the handsomest, the richest, the most dashing, charismatic, and wild playboy in England, who could easily have taken his charm and his good looks and his money and done nothing with his life except chase pretty girls and buy handsome horses, but instead, somehow, for some reason, fell completely in love with science, or as he would have called it, natural philosophy. And at a very young age, he took a giant chunk of his own inheritance, and he invested in Captain Cook's first voyage around the world. He basically bankrolled it in exchange for a seat on that voyage. More than one seat, because he brought along with him on that trip 2 black manservants, 2 white manservants, 2 artistic draftsmen, a scientific secretary, and a pair of Italian greyhounds. Just the very essence of what you would need as a gentleman on an 18th century voyage around the world in a ship about as big as this stage. But what was more interesting to me was what he brought back, and what Banks brought back from that voyage was 4,000 specimens of plants that were previously unknown to Western science. And then he settled into his new position as the superintendent of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, and he put those 4,000 plants into taxonomical order, thus essentially revolutionizing modern botany. And then what he did, because I started to veer away from Cook and look more deeply into his life, what I found really fascinating was that he spent the rest of his life at considerable personal expense recruiting brave and intelligent young Englishmen to send out across the world on botanical explorations similar to the one that he had done with Cook. And this struck me as very odd because when you look into those botanical journeys, you discover that not only were they very expensive, they were really high risk. They were life and death operations. A great number of those young men never came home again. And I started to wonder what possibly could have been the motive to have spent that much money and put people at so much risk to send them to the furthest corners of the earth to collect plants, until the motive slowly became clear: money. Money, lots of money. Sometimes money disguised as glory, but generally speaking, just flat out money. And when you look at that really interesting moment between the end of the Age of Enlightenment and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, what you find is that most of the really big capitalistic and colonial ventures of that time were based in plants, whether it was the cotton trade or the spice trade or the wild speculation in coffee, tea, and sugar, whether it was the rubber trade that was just beginning around that time, not to mention lumber, not to mention the medicinal and pharmaceutical trade that was incredibly lucrative in that age before modern medicine, when people were desperately looking for cures from the botanical world. At that moment in history, if you could find a plant that could change the world, you could change the world. And that was the motive. And that, to me, suddenly felt like the best idea for a novel, to write about that exact moment in history, about botanical exploration, its risks and its rewards. And so I started to imagine a family of 18th and 19th century botanical explorers. And very soon, as I continued with my research, the characters started to come to me. And the first would be the patriarch, whose name was to be Henry Whittaker. Henry Whittaker was a poor-born English orchardman's son who grew up at Kew Gardens, where his father worked, who was ambitious and brilliant and had a gift for trees, especially for fruiting trees, and who had great aspirations for himself in the world, but no way to advance because of his station in life. and so in an early age became a plant thief. I'd learned that plant theft was a common and lucrative and dangerous crime in England at that time. It was a hanging crime. And young Henry is caught stealing plants from Kew, but instead of being sent to hang, he is delivered to none other than Sir Joseph Banks himself, who sees a spark of brilliance in this boy and ambition and toughness, and thinks that he might have what it takes to become a botanical explorer. And to test him out, he sends him as an assistant botanist on Captain Cook's third voyage around the world. So there at last, Captain Cook comes into play, into the story. Henry not so much learns botany on that 4-year voyage, but conquers it, comes back and is sent down to the Peruvian Andes, where he single-handedly breaks the Spanish embargo on the quinine trade, or I think as you say it, quinning. He becomes a millionaire and settles in Philadelphia, where he essentially establishes the American pharmaceutical industry. But Henry Whittaker was not to be the star of my novel. I wanted to write about a woman, and so I imagined a daughter that would come out of a guy like that. And she would be Alma Whittaker, a plain and brilliant and ambitious young botanist in her own right, who grew up with this father who had tales of the whole entire known world. She had the run of his greenhouses, the run of his library, which was the finest free library in Philadelphia. And she grows up to become an incredibly impassioned student of plants herself, and upon her father's death, she's the one who turns into the world explorer and who goes to the end of the earth to find out nothing less than the origins of life itself. I knew from the beginning that I wanted this book to be about discovery, about science, about adventure, but I was surprised as I began writing it to learn what it really is a book about inheritance, particularly about intellectual inheritance. You will probably not be surprised to learn that when it came time to develop the character of Henry Whittaker, I based him almost entirely on my great-grandfather. He was mercurial, he was reckless, he was domineering, he was temperamental, he was narcissistic, and he was adored by his daughter in the same way that I adored my great-grandfather, and for the same reason, because Henry Whittaker, my fictitious character, had one supremely redeeming quality, and that was, is that for me, Emily? Is that your agent telling you to write that novel? No, don't worry about it. Henry Whittaker had one redeeming quality, which is that he loved plants, just as my great-grandfather had one redeeming quality, that he loved books. And he passed that love down to his daughter in the same way that my great-grandfather passed that love down to me. And in so doing, it gives her the entire world. And she's grateful for that in the same way that I've always been grateful for that, because I know that not everybody gets given the entire world at such a young age. So I know writers are not supposed to say this or ever confess this. I know that we are only supposed to advertise our misery and suffering. But just between us, I will tell you that I have never had more flat-out fun and joy in my life than I had writing The Signature of All Things. And some of that was because I got to just geek out completely over 19th century botany, and I got to spend 3 years in botanical libraries learning everything I could about that world, which to me just is the height of amusement. But beyond that, I think that it was so joyful for me because I felt as though I were honoring and I was living out my own family's inheritance in some very accurate and personal way that I had never really been able to synthesize before. If you think of it this way, I'm a woman who was born in the 20th century, writing a novel in the 21st century based on a volume that was published in the 18th century that was collected, preserved, and passed down to me by a man born in the 19th century, which is a long lineage and a really remarkable one, and it was an honor to be able to see it through to the end. So my great-grandfather, I said it before, not a great guy, not somebody who you would want to emulate, not somebody who I would want to emulate, and none of us should want to be like him. He did not have a good character, but he was a good character. And as a young future novelist growing up, there's nothing luckier than to grow up with good characters in your life, and I'm so honored that I had him. He was a bit mad, he was reckless, he was impetuous, he was mean to his kids, he was irresponsible, he pawned his wife's wedding silver. I don't care, because he kept the books. You know, I don't need the wedding silver. I can eat with plastic forks as long as I have the books. And he passed them to me. He put them in my hands, and in so doing, My great-grandfather gave me a gift that was far more valuable than anything that he ever squandered, sold, or pawned. He gave me the gift of story, which I do think is the highest human endowment. And all I have tried to do with my entire life's work, but most particularly with this book that is so special to my heart, all I have tried to do is to take that inheritance of story and to preserve it myself, to grow it into something interesting, and then to pass it along. So thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. Thanks.